A $57 million jet sat abandoned on a runway for 6 years, and the man who brought it back to life got stiffed for $180. Wichita, Kansas, Hangar 14, Cessna Aviation Field, 7:14 a.m. Renata Voss stood at the base of the jet's air stairs, holding an invoice for $180 and refusing to sign it. Elias Thorne stood across from her, oil still on his hands, saying nothing. Behind him, taped inside his toolbox lid, was a folded photograph of the aircraft's original inspection crew, 6 years old, half the faces crossed out in pen. Nobody had asked him about it yet. Nobody knew it was there. $180, Voss said. For what exactly? Elias said a fuel sensor gasket. 40 cents in parts. The rest is 11 weeks of labor you're not being charged. He'd spent 11 weeks restoring that Gulfstream, working nights after his shift at the county maintenance yard, teaching himself the aircraft's original blueprints because Kirkland Holdings had lost the paperwork years before he ever touched it. 11 weeks, no contract, a handshake deal with a man who no longer worked for the company. Voss's father had made that deal. Voss's father was dead 4 months now, and she had inherited a jet, a company, and a $180 invoice from a mechanic she'd never met until that morning. "It's $180, she said again, like repeating the number made it smaller. "Sign the release." Elias folded the airworthiness release and slid it into his jacket pocket instead of handing it over. "There isn't a version of this where I sign for free. 53 pilots have already turned this aircraft down before you ever offered them $1. You've got 11 minutes before your flight window closes, and not one of them is walking near that cockpit without my signature on this page." Elias Thorne lived 18 minutes from the hangar on a rented house on Melrose Street, the kind of street where every driveway had at least one car up on blocks. He'd been in that house for 9 years, since the divorce split what little he and his ex-wife owned right down the middle. The rent was $940 a month. He was $60 behind on it that week, and had been $60 behind for going on 3 weeks now, a gap he kept meaning to close and kept not closing. He worked 2 jobs, days at the Sedgwick County Maintenance Yard, fixing township trucks and school buses for $19.40 an hour, nights and weekends at Cessna Aviation Field, picking up whatever line work the regular mechanics didn't want, cash some weeks, a check other weeks, never anything guaranteed. He'd been doing it that way for 6 years, since Halloran Aerospace shut its regional office and let go of 83 engineers in a single afternoon, Elias among them, with 14 years of service and a severance check that lasted 4 months if he was careful. Nobody at the hangar asked about Halloran. Most of them didn't know the name. To the pilots who flew out of Cessna Field, Elias was the quiet one in gray coveralls who showed up early, said little, and always finished the job clean. He didn't correct anyone who assumed he'd learned wrenches instead of blueprints. He didn't mention the 14 years, the patents, the reports with his name on the cover page. He'd learned that mentioning it only invited questions he didn't want to answer, mainly why a man who used to design aircraft systems was now replacing gaskets for $19.40 an hour. The truth was simple, and he kept it to himself the way he kept most things to himself. He ate the same breakfast every morning, black coffee and 2 eggs, standing at the counter because sitting down felt like a luxury he hadn't earned yet that day. He kept his tools organized the way his father had taught him 30 years earlier, every wrench back in its slot before he allowed himself to call a job finished. It was one of the only things in his life that still worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The Gulfstream had been sitting in the back corner of Hangar 14 for 6 years before Kirkland Holdings called about it, and the call only came because a buyer had shown interest and the sale couldn't close without an airworthiness inspection first. The ground crew supervisor handed Elias the work order on a Monday morning without much explanation, just a tail number and a note that said full inspection, get it flight ready. Nobody expected the job to take more than a week or two. Parked aircraft usually just needed fluids changed and seals checked. That was the assumption going in. Elias started with the fuel system because that was where he always started, and on the second day he found something that didn't sit right with him. The fuel sensor readings were inconsistent by a margin that shouldn't have existed on an aircraft that had simply sit still. Sitting aircraft drifted a little over time. That was normal, expected, nothing worth flagging. This drift was different, uneven in a way that suggested the sensor had been tampered with at some point, not failed on its own. He mentioned it to the ground crew supervisor, a man named Roy Castellano, who'd run that hangar for 11 years and seen every kind of mechanical oddity a parked plane could produce. Castellano looked at the readings, shrugged, and said sitting planes did strange things, said it happened more than people realized, and moved on to the next line item on his clipboard without giving it more than 10 seconds of thought. Elias didn't argue. He wasn't in the business of arguing with the man who signed his checks over a reading that might mean nothing, but he didn't let it go either. He photographed the sensor housing before he replaced it, photographed the wiring behind it too, the way a man does when something feels slightly wrong and he doesn't yet have the words to explain why. He kept working through the week, clearing item after item off the inspection list, hydraulics, avionics, the airframe itself, all of it coming back clean, all of it exactly what a 6-year dormancy should look like. Only the fuel sensor stood out, a single detail that didn't match the rest of the story the aircraft was otherwise telling him. He didn't mention it again to Castellano. He filed the photographs on his phone in a folder he didn't name, the way a man sets something aside without deciding yet whether it matters, and kept his eyes open for whatever came next. By the second week, 3 other men had looked at the fuel sensor, and all 3 of them told Elias the same thing in slightly different words. It was nothing. The first was Deacon Farr, an avionics specialist Kirkland Holdings brought in from Tulsa on a $2,200 contract to sign off on the electrical systems. Farr spent 4 hours going through the wiring harness, ran 2 diagnostic cycles, and declared the sensor drift within acceptable tolerance for an aircraft that had sat unused. He wrote it up that way in his report, clean and confident, the kind of language that closed a question instead of leaving it open. The second was Roy Castellano again, this time with the inspection checklist fully filled out and a buyer's representative standing beside him wanting assurance more than accuracy. Castellano told the representative the aircraft was in excellent condition for its age, better than expected, honestly, and the representative wrote that down and seemed satisfied with it. The third was Vance Whitlock, an independent inspector Kirkland Holdings paid $1,800 to provide a second opinion before the sale went through, a man with 31 years in the business and a reputation for being thorough. Whitlock spent a full day on the aircraft, tested the sensor readings against 3 separate reference points, and told Castellano flatly that Elias was overthinking a normal quirk of long-term storage. Wiring degrades unevenly, he said. It happens. It didn't mean sabotage. It didn't mean failure. It meant an old plane behaving like an old plane. Elias listened to all of them and said very little in response because he didn't have proof yet, only a feeling built on 11 weeks of close observation, and a feeling wasn't something you argued with 3 paid experts over. He signed off on the rest of the inspection, item by item, the way the job required him to, and left the fuel sensor listed as replaced and functioning within spec, which was technically true and didn't feel entirely honest at the same time. Renata Voss, going through the sale paperwork that week from her office, read Whitlock's report and felt the small relief of a complicated problem solving itself without her involvement. Her father had left her a jet nobody wanted and a company that needed the sale money more than she'd admitted to the board yet, and 3 signed reports telling her the aircraft was sound was exactly the outcome she needed by the end of the month. Only Elias kept the photographs. He didn't delete the folder. He didn't know yet what he was keeping it for, only that something about the sensor still didn't sit right, no matter how many men with more letters after their names told him otherwise. The sale to the outside buyer fell through in the 3rd week, not because of anything Elias had flagged, but because the buyer's own insurance underwriter requested the aircraft's full incident history before finalizing terms, a standard request that Kirkland Holdings had apparently hoped nobody would make. The underwriter came back within 2 days, asking why 6 years of maintenance records existed for an aircraft that showed no corresponding flight logs for the 18 months before it was grounded. Renata didn't understand the question when her assistant first related it to her. She'd inherited the jet along with the company and had never once looked closely at its history before her father died, only at its price tag. She asked Castellano for the logs herself, and Castellano, after a long pause that told her more than his answer did, said the logs from that period were incomplete, always had been, nothing unusual for an aircraft that old. Elias heard about the stalled sale from another mechanic on a Thursday afternoon and did something he hadn't in 3 weeks. He pulled his phone folder back open and looked at the sensor photographs again, this time next to the maintenance records Castellano had handed him at the start of the job, records that listed a full inspection 18 months before the aircraft was grounded, the same inspection that supposedly found nothing wrong. The dates didn't match the sensor's wear pattern. A sensor that had simply drifted from 6 years of sitting still would show even degradation across its service life. This one showed a sharp change concentrated in a narrow window, the same 18-month window the insurance underwriter was asking about, the same window with no flight logs to explain it. Elias sat with that for a long time before he did anything about it, turning it over the way he turned over every uncomfortable fact before deciding what it meant. An aircraft doesn't get grounded for 6 years without a reason serious enough to justify walking away from a $57 million asset. Companies didn't abandon planes that valuable over routine maintenance. They abandoned them when something happened that was cheaper to bury than to report. He didn't have the full picture yet, only a pattern that 3 paid experts had missed, or chosen not to see. A pattern that lined up with a missing 18 months nobody at Kirkland Holdings seemed eager to explain. He photographed the maintenance records too, added them to the same unnamed folder, and for the first time since he'd started this job, he began to suspect the $180 invoice waiting for him at the end of it was never going to be the real problem here. Elias didn't take his suspicion to Castellano. Castellano had already signed off on the aircraft twice and had every reason to want the questions to stop, not multiply. Instead, Elias spent his own time, unpaid, cross-referencing the tail number against public FAA incident filings, the kind of records any licensed mechanic could pull if he knew where to look and was patient enough to read through pages that told him nothing until one of them told him something. 18 months before the aircraft was grounded, it had reported a fuel system fault mid-flight over Oklahoma, forced an early descent into a regional airport, and no follow-up inspection report existed anywhere in the public filing. The fault matched the sensor pattern in front of him almost exactly. Someone had cleared the aircraft after that flight without properly documenting what caused it, then let the plane sit untouched for 6 years rather than risk anyone looking closely enough to ask why. He brought what he had to Renata directly, not to Castellano, because Castellano had a stake in this being nothing, and Renata, as far as Elias could tell, still didn't fully understand what she'd inherited. She listened to him in her office, arms crossed, skeptical in the particular way of someone who'd already been told 3 times by paid experts that the plane was fine. "You're telling me a $19 an hour mechanic caught something a licensed inspector and an avionics specialist both missed?" she said. "I'm telling you the dates line up," Elias said. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to pull the incident file yourself and read it." She pulled it. It took her assistant less than an hour to confirm the filing existed exactly the way Elias described it, an in-flight fault with no closing inspection report, followed by 6 years of silence that made considerably more sense once she understood what it was covering. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a number stops being an abstraction. Renata had been trying to sell an aircraft with an unresolved safety fault buried in its history, based on the say-so of 3 men who'd either missed it or been paid well enough not to look. Elias hadn't fixed anything yet. He'd simply been the only person in 3 weeks who kept looking after everyone else had already decided to stop.
The incident file led to a name Elias didn't recognize, but Renata did immediately. A maintenance contractor called Averline Field Services, paid $340,000 over 4 years by Kirkland Holdings for inspection work across the fleet, including the closing report that was supposed to exist for the Oklahoma incident and never did. Renata pulled the vendor records herself that same afternoon instead of asking her assistant to do it, something she realized afterwards she should have done the day her father died and hadn't. Averline's owner of record was a man named Curtis Renfro, and Curtis Renfro, according to a state business filing buried 3 clicks deep, was also listed as a silent partner in a leasing company that had quietly purchased 2 aircraft from Kirkland Holdings at well below market value in the years since the Gulfstream was grounded. The pattern took shape slowly, the way these things always did once someone finally looked. Renfro's company had been closing out inspections without doing them, collecting the fee regardless, and using the cover of routine maintenance paperwork to keep problem aircraft quietly out of circulation long enough to buy them cheap once Kirkland's board grew tired of carrying dead assets on the books. The Gulfstream wasn't an oversight. It was supposed to become the 3rd aircraft in that pattern, and would have if the sale to the outside buyer hadn't triggered an insurance review nobody at Kirkland had planned for. Renata sat with the paperwork spread across her desk and felt something colder than anger settle into her chest. Her father had signed contracts with Renfro for 6 years without catching any of it, or perhaps had caught pieces of it and decided it wasn't worth the fight in his final years running the company. Either way, it had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone with no stake in protecting the arrangement to finally read the right file on the right afternoon. She called Roy Castellano into her office that evening and watched him closely as she laid out what she'd found. Castellano didn't defend Renfro. He didn't defend himself either, not really, only said quietly that he'd signed what he was told to sign because questioning Averline's paperwork had never once been part of his job description, and he had a mortgage of his own to think about. Renata didn't answer him right away. She was thinking instead about a mechanic in gray coveralls who'd been owed $180 for 3 weeks and spent that entire time chasing a truth that cost him nothing to ignore and everything to pursue. The story didn't break because Renata called a press conference. It broke because Wallace Kepner, a charter pilot out of Topeka who'd been one of the 53 men to turn down the Gulfstream 3 weeks earlier, ran into Elias at a supply counter in Wichita and asked, mostly out of curiosity, what was actually wrong with that plane. Elias told him the short version, the fault, the missing report, the 6 years of silence. Kepner repeated it to 2 other pilots that same week, the way information always moved through that community, quietly and person to person, and by the following Monday, Kirkland Holdings' insurance underwriter had heard a version of it independently and called Renata directly, asking her to explain. She didn't deny any of it. She handed over the incident file, the Averline contracts, and the leasing company records herself before the underwriter had to ask twice, because she decided somewhere in the last week that burying it further would make her exactly the kind of executive her father had allowed himself to become in his final years. The underwriter passed the file to the FAA's regional office the same day, and Curtis Renfro's company lost its inspection authority within 2 weeks, pending a federal review that would take considerably longer to finish. None of it involved a courtroom speech or a public confrontation. Renata simply told the truth to the people who asked, plainly, the same way Elias had told her the truth about a $180 invoice 3 weeks earlier when she hadn't wanted to hear it.
What became public and what mattered most to the men who worked the tarmac at Cessna Field was simpler than any of the financial detail. A mechanic making $19.40 an hour had caught a safety fault that an $1,800 inspector and a $2,200 avionics specialist had both missed or been paid to overlook. He hadn't done it for credit. He'd done it because a folder of sensor photographs bothered him enough that he couldn't put it down, even when nobody was asking him to keep looking. Wallace Kepner called Elias again that Friday, this time to tell him that every pilot who declined the Gulfstream knew exactly why they'd been right, too. Nobody threw Elias a parade, nobody expected one, but something shifted quietly among the pilots and mechanics who worked that field, the particular kind of respect that doesn't announce itself, it just changes how carefully people listen the next time a man says a plane isn't ready to fly. Renata paid the $180 invoice within the hour of reading the incident file, wired directly instead of routed through accounting, along with a formal contract offer that hadn't existed 3 weeks earlier. She drove to the hangar herself to deliver it, no assistant, and found Elias exactly where she'd found him the first morning, tightening a bolt on a different aircraft entirely, unhurried, unimpressed by the office car parked outside. "I want you running fleet safety inspections, not contract work, a real position, a real salary, direct authority to ground anything you don't trust, no sign-off from anyone above you." Elias took the offer letter, read it once, and folded it the way he folded most paperwork that mattered, carefully, without ceremony. "I don't want this because you feel guilty. Guilt fades. I want it because you actually need someone in that hangar who'll tell you the truth, even when it costs the company money." "That's the only reason I'm offering it," said Renata, and found the words came easier than she expected. He accepted 2 days later. Roy Castellano kept his job on the condition that every inspection going forward ran through an independent second review, a condition Castellano didn't fight, having learned firsthand what silence cost when it went unquestioned long enough. Curtis Renfro's federal case moved slowly through the following year, the way these cases always did, ending in restitution and a permanent loss of his inspection license, a fraction of what the damage had actually cost Kirkland Holdings over 4 years. Renata restructured how the board reviewed maintenance spending, opening every quarterly meeting with a safety report before a single number about revenue was discussed, a small change that cost nothing on paper and altered, according to more than one mechanic on that field, how it felt to work for the company at all. 6 months later, pilots from 3 states called ahead just to confirm whether Elias Torn had personally signed off on an aircraft before agreeing to fly it, a habit that had become, without anyone deciding it should, a kind of shorthand for safety itself across that whole region. On a Friday evening in late autumn, Elias stood near the hangar doors with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the sky turn the particular color it holds for a few minutes before dusk. He thought about the 14 years he'd walked away with once, and the 6 years he'd spent quietly rebuilding a different version of the same conviction, one gasket, one photograph, one unanswered question at a time. He hadn't done any of it for recognition. He'd simply kept looking, long after everyone else had already decided to stop.